Hello,
Hi there. How are you doing?
I am good.
It's an honor to meet you. I can't tell you, like I'm sure get interviewed by a lot of people, and they all say the same thing of how you shaped their love of action movies, and I'm no different.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, I have people who've told me, thank you for my childhood.
Yes, exactly.
So I've heard that one a bunch of times. So, so you are John Jerva, right?
I am, sir. Yes,
All
and
right.
and I'm with ACTION-FLIX.com. This is for my podcast, The Action Fix. And let me just introduce everybody to Sheldon Lettich. If you're an action fan, you definitely know who my guest is. You know, Lionheart, Double Impact, Only the Strong. So many influential action movies. I mean, you're like when people talk about Van Damme, Double Impact, Lionheart, those besides Bloodsport, obviously,
Right,
those three
right.
movies are the ones that people generally like gravitate towards. How does it feel to like, be one of the ones responsible for showcasing him to the world way back when?
I don't know. It feels great. It's like, you know, we're talking 30, 35, 40 years later. I got people like you doing Zoom calls with me and talking about these movies. I never anticipated. Look, back in the 1980s, there was no internet. There was no Zoom calls. I didn't anticipate anything like this.
Right.
If any, all I could have anticipated is um, maybe doing a little publicity for the movie after it opened, but I wasn't expecting uh, this kind of these accolades 40 years later. Bloodsport, that's a pretty popular one also, and I
Yes.
wrote that.
Yes.
Didn't direct that one, but uh, that's one of the most popular titles, actually. Of all my movies, I think the most people have heard of Bloodsport. Like a few years ago, Donald Trump was even touting it as one of his top 10 movies. It was right
Right.
up there. Did you know this?
Yes, I heard. Yes, I saw that.
Yeah, it was right up there with Citizen Kane and Gone with the Wind. So uh, that's pretty amazing that people love the movie that much, and they still do.
Right. And I also love the fact, I mean, Rambo 3, you wrote Rambo 3 too. A lot of people probably do not know that you're
Oops, we got a
responsible
little
for
glitch here.
what's that?
Oh, the video stopped for just a
Oh,
second. So, but it seems like we're back on track now.
okay, no problem, no worries. Yeah, so like you wrote Rambo 3,
Well,
obviously the
co-wrote it.
third, yeah, co-wrote it.
Co-wrote it.
I'm sorry, yeah,
Oh,
co-wrote it. Yes,
yeah.
absolutely. So that, I always like to talk about that too, because, I mean, in terms of Rambo 3, I mean, like, obviously, the first one was influential. The second one was pretty much what, catapulted, like mainstream action movies and cinema and stuff like that with
Oh,
Stallone
we
and
got another
Schwarzenegger.
glitch here. We had another little dropout glitch there for a brief second. So could you repeat the question again, if
Yeah,
possible?
so I'm just because in terms of writing, co-writing Rambo 3, how did you come up with the idea? Just real quick, because now and then I'll go into Firefight, which is what we're going to talk about. I
Right.
always wanted to talk to you about how you got the idea, for Rambo 3.
It just seemed obvious. The second Rambo film took place in Vietnam. The villains were Russians, and Rambo goes to Vietnam to rescue POWs.
Right.
And so now, a few years later, Afghanistan was in the news, and
Yes.
once again, it's a foreign country. Russians are there. Russians are killing people. Russians, and this time they're holding Troutman hostage. So it was just a no. It was a no-brainer. There was just no other idea for Rambo 3. Although Sly got nervous about Afghanistan for a while, and we came up with an alternate scenario that took place in Siberia, of all places, um, where uh, Rambo go, and I believe I can't. I think maybe there were some hostages being held there also, but he goes to Siberia. He has to rescue somebody and get him out of Siberia. And Siberia is only about 50 miles from Alaska. There's just a
Mm-hmm.
very small gap between the two. So that's basically how that worked. That he had to cross that gap. I think it was the Bering Strait, and that's how he got into Russia, and that's how he got back to the U.S.
Right.
So that was an alternate idea, but eventually we came back to Afghanistan, which made the most sense. That's people were talking about Afghanistan at the time. It was in the news. The Americans were supplying the Afghan rebels with Stinger missiles that would shoot down helicopters. So unfortunately, it took a long time to get the production going.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't know where they wanted to shoot it. They sent Russell Mulcahy was the original director, and they sent him all over the world looking for a location that could function as Afghanistan. And one of the first suggestions I gave to Stallone was, "Hey, what about Israel?" And he said, "I ain't going to no Israel because there's terrorism, there's bombings, there's all kinds of." Yeah, it was a dangerous place in many
Right.
ways. So once you go over there, you realize it's actually safer than the United States.
Imagine
You
that.
can walk the streets at night. I made 2 movies in Israel afterwards, and you'd see kids on a Saturday night, 11 p.m. They're wandering the streets in little groups. I'm talking about 10-year-olds, 11-year-olds. So
Right.
it's actually pretty damn safe over there. And of course they do have their incidents, but it's a lot more dangerous here in the streets of New York or LA. Anyway, so Sly eventually came around, decided, yeah, we'll shoot in Israel. And Israel had a lot of what we needed. First of all, it had the correct terrain, had desert terrain, and there are parts of Afghanistan are very mountainous. Parts are there's a lot of desert sections also, but most of all, the Israelis have a lot of captured Soviet military equipment
Mm-hmm.
because they fought a number of wars with
Right.
the Arabs, and the Arabs were getting. It was an interesting Cold War phenomenon at the time. The U.S. was supplying Israel with weapons. Why were they supplying Israel? This is how this whole thing got started, because the Soviets were supplying the Arabs with weapons, all right? So they wanted to control the whole area. And the U.S., I believe it was, Johnson is the first one who sent weapons to Israel. And then it kind of became a habit, and Reagan increased it exponentially. He sent a lot of stuff to Israel. But the Israelis, when they'd fight with the Arabs, they'd capture all this equipment. So there's all the Soviet stuff there. So it's all authentic stuff. And it was just sitting there. And they, some of it was destroyed, but some of it was in good working order. So they basically had all the vehicles and props supplied courtesy of the Soviet Union. So Israel worked out really good for that reason, and a few others. And it also had a film industry. It had it had technicians, it had cameras, it had equipment, everything was there. So Israel ended up being a good location for that movie to be shot.
Cool. So now let's go way back. Let's take the time machine way back. We're talking about Firefight, of course, the short film that you did. And I had talked to Brian Thompson a couple of weeks ago. I interviewed him about it, and that was his first. That was his first acting job. I was unaware of that. So that was kind of cool to hear him talk about that.
Yeah.
So take us through. As an aspiring filmmaker, how did this whole concept come about? The short film Firefight about Vietnam and the soldiers fighting in Vietnam.
Now, you've heard of my biography, right?
Of course.
All right, so here it is. So folks can see it
from Vietnam to Van Damme.
Vietnam to Van Damme.
Yep.
Okay, and I write about all this stuff extensively in this book.
Right.
I worked on it with a journalist named Corey Dana. So we got to go back a few years earlier, even, where I worked on a theatrical piece called Tracers.
Yes.
And Tracers was something that I worked on with, I believe, maybe 7 other Vietnam veterans, all of whom were aspiring actors also. and the director was a Vietnam veteran. We were all Vietnam veterans, so we were talking about swapping stories, talking about experiences over there, and we all felt comfortable with one another because it was uncomfortable to talk to just the general public at the time, because there was a lot of negative stories about Vietnam, My Lai and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
So we would feel comfortable talking to other vets who had been there and who pretty much knew the whole story, and who we all knew how one another felt about it. We had very different experiences, but there was a certain comfort level. So I'm the one who did the writing for that play,
Mm-hmm.
and it was staged. We staged it in Los Angeles at a very prestigious small theater called the Odyssey, and then it went to the public theater in New York, and it was in New York City,
Mm-hmm.
and then it was Steppenwolf Theater, which was directed by Gary Sinise, who was the head of the Steppenwolf Theater at the time. This is
Right.
prior to being Lieutenant Dan in Forrest Gump.
Absolutely.
So, anyways, Firefight was a scene that I wrote for this play, and it was based on a few stories I heard from this guy, a few stories from that guy, some of my own experiences. Put it all together. It was a short scene, but the director wisely decided we can't stage this on a small theater. It's just too big. It's got battles. It's got helicopters. All this stuff. So we're not going to use it. So Sheldon, you can have this one piece. Do whatever you want with it. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And I really liked this scene, and I wanted to do something with it. It was bugging me that we didn't get a chance to present it. Although it made perfect sense that we didn't try to present it. It would have been pretty close to impossible to do.
Right.
So a few years later, I'm still thinking about this short scene, and I wrote it up in screenplay form. And this is after I went to the American Film Institute. So I learned a lot about directing and cinematography, and basically how to put a movie together at the AFI. And so now I was ready to go out and make a little movie. For the most part, I just felt the urge to turn this into a movie. But I also figured if it turns out good, I can use it as a demo reel to try and get some directing jobs.
Absolutely.
And it's doing that for me. That was the final nail in the coffin for me directing Lionheart, because Jean-Claude wanted me to direct it. The producer was nervous about that. The producer wanted Eric Carson to direct it. And eventually, Sunil Shah was convinced when he saw Firefight. And I had it on 35 millimeter. So it looked pretty cool. It was big. Otherwise, back then, there was no digital. Back then, there was no YouTube.
Right.
So otherwise, it would have been on a 1/2-inch VHS, which looked like shit. So I shot it in 16 millimeter, spent the extra money to blow it up to 35, did a sound mix and everything. So it looked like a real movie. It sounded like a real movie, especially if you saw it in a screening room projected in 35 millimeter. So Sunil saw it in 35 millimeter, and he said, okay, well, let's give this guy a chance. But they still had Eric Carson there, basically looking over my shoulder, just in case I couldn't handle directing the movie. But nowadays, the verdict nowadays is that I did a pretty damn good job in that movie.
Yes, you did. Yeah. No complaints.
It's still a very popular film. But so Firefight helped me get that, and that was half of my motivation. And then for the actors, like for Brian Thompson, we put an ad in a little. There was this little periodical that used to come out once a week called Dramalog.
Okay.
That would advertise, low budget movies, advertise roles for actors. Right. And so Brian saw that. I have to just ask him to hold the noise down in the next room. Okay.
No worries.
Can you guys hold the noise down a little bit, please? Okay, John, I'm back. Um, so that's how I got Frank Dukes involved, because I knew Frank at the time. This was prior to Bloodsport being written. This is we were just hanging out. I met him through my agent, and we were hanging out. We were just swapping stories. He told me a lot of stories about the Kumite,
Mm-hmm.
which all turned out to be bullshit, but it was an interesting story. So he's telling me he participated in this Kumite, and he had a magazine, Black Belt magazine, had an article on it, basically backed up everything he was saying, that there really was this Kumite, and Frank participated in it. So who am I to doubt Black Belt magazine? All right, I didn't know much about martial arts or the whole martial arts world. So we were hanging out, and he told me these stories. And I got him involved with Firefight. I told him I'm going to do this little movie in 16 millimeter. If you can help me out with it, I'll give you one of the leading roles, because Frank at the time felt that he was movie star material, movie star or TV star, but he felt that he had some screen presence, charisma, wanted to be a movie star. And I said, okay, I'll put you in this movie. You'll have one of the lead roles, and you'll have some film on yourself. And that's why everybody else who got involved, because we weren't paying salaries.
Mm-hmm.
People basically worked for free. And this is a lot of work. Right? It was like 2 long weekends, drove down to Camp Pendleton. Basically the actors, there was no pay, but they were hoping, well, I promised everybody a 1/2-inch VHS. So they would at least have themselves on tape. And that's what you really need to get some acting work. You need some tape. You need some film of yourself doing a role. So that's how I got Brian Thompson and Philip Ree and Simon Ree got involved, and we had some other really good actors in there. That's how Frank got involved. He figured I'll use this as my entree to become an actor, become a star. I'll have some film to show them. We didn't have Kickstarter back then or anything like that.
Right.
So I went to friends and family, raised some money, we had some contracts written out for people to put money in and guarantee that they would get their money back. And they all did. Everybody who put money in got their money back from this. So that's how I financed it. And nowadays, I would probably have done Kickstarter or something like that.
Of course.
Would have shot it with an iPhone, maybe. or
Right.
It's so easy to do this stuff nowadays.
I know. Yeah.
Get a digital camera. There's all this digital editing stuff you can have on your computer, your home computer. It's easy to do. Back then, I had to rent the equipment, 16 millimeter cameras. You got to buy the film stock. You got to get the film stock developed after you shoot it. And then after you shoot it, then there's a whole bunch of other processes before it becomes a finished movie. You can't just do it all on an editing console. Basically, you're taking film, you're taping the splices together, and then you got to make a dupe of that so you can do the sound work. It's just a whole process that nobody has to really do anymore. In fact, even for big feature films, nobody does this anymore. Nobody shoots in 35 millimeter. It was a real learning experience, and it took about a year actually to get all the post-production work done. And it took more money. That's why we shot the film in 83, but the copyright says 1986, because that's when we finally had the
That's when you finally got it done. Yeah. Okay.
Totally done. I was giving the VHS copies out to people, so that's when we did the copyright on it. That was pretty much the process for getting that little movie made, and it didn't just get me Lionheart. Sam Raimi was a big fan of it. I showed it to. I was a pretty good friend with Sam back then. Showed him the film. He really liked it, and he got me a directing deal at with Dino De Laurentiis. Dino had a company back then called DEG, De Laurentiis Entertainment Group, and I hooked up with a young writer named Chuck Farr. So Chuck Farr and I wrote a script for Jean-Claude to star in. Jean-Claude was going to star. The title of the script was Atlas, and it was basically Spartacus in space. Spartacus.
Okay.
Yeah, kind of a cool idea, right?
Right.
It's like they're like gladiators. They first find him in working the mines on some distant asteroid, and he gets forcibly recruited, and now he's a gladiator. So Dino liked the script, and everything was moving forward in pre-production, and then DEG went belly up. They ran out of money, so so the movie couldn't happen. This has happened a few times to me. You read the book, you'll see the stories. That basically that's what happened with Canon.
Yes.
Yeah, because originally Double Impact was originally a Canon production. It was going to be called the Corsican Brothers.
Right, I remember. Yep.
Okay, and again, it's in the book, but
Yep.
They sent me and Jean-Claude to Paris and Corsica. I was doing some scouting. They made an ad. They had a big, beautiful double-page spread. I took publicity photos of Jean-Claude playing the two brothers, but they were going to be Corsican and French, rather than it was not going to take place in Hong Kong.
Right.
So then one day I'm informed that the movie's not happening. We're shutting it down. What the hell? What's that all about? So I call Menachem and I ask him, hey, what's going on? We were moving forward with pre-production. We had posters and everything. And he said, and I'm quoting, he didn't like Jean-Claude. He didn't think Jean-Claude was a good actor. He said, Van Damme can't play one role. How do you expect him to play two? The real reason was that they were out of money. Okay, but that was the bullshit excuse he gave me.
Yeah, he needed an excuse. Yeah.
It's a long story after that, where we ended up, and I ended up having to sue Canon because they didn't pay me for doing a rewrite on Delta Force 2, and to make the lawsuit go away, they made a deal with me. They said, look, we'll give you the Corsican Brothers script. You can have it. We'll sign it over to you, but you drop the lawsuit. And I said, okay, fine. So I dropped the lawsuit because what they didn't know at the time was that Jean-Claude had been talking to Moshe Diamant about making a movie for him, or making a few movies for him. And Moshe was in the middle. They were shooting Stone Cold at the time. So they had another project. I'm kind of getting long-winded about this, but it's an interesting story. And
no, please, no, go on.
All right, it's all in the book. So,
right.
Anyways, they had another project called Night of the Leopard. They had a script, Night of the Leopard, that they were going to shoot. And this was going to be Jean-Claude starring, Moshe Diamant producing. I forgot who the director was supposed to be, but they lost that title. They lost that script. Whatever happened with that script, I don't know for sure, but they had it and then they didn't have it. And Jean-Claude calls me and said, oh shit, we need another script. We just lost Night of the Leopard. And he says, hey, what about that Corsican Brothers script? And it's all, the planets were aligning here, okay? Because this happened right when Canon was settling with me for the script. So I told Jean-Claude, well, I got some good news for you. Canon's going to give me the script if I drop the lawsuit. Oh, well, you're going to do that, aren't you? Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so let me get that taken care of. So I go to Canon. They've got the paperwork. I sign the paperwork. They sign the paperwork. Now I've got the paperwork. Corsican Brothers belongs to me. I call Jean-Claude and I say, hey, I got the paper in my hand. I'm over to Moshe's house like tonight. Okay, his lawyer is going to be there. Everybody's going to be there. All right, so I go to Moshe's house And yeah, there's the lawyer, and everybody's ready to go. I got the paperwork. I mean, the ink was barely dry on this paperwork. Okay, and so here we go. All right.
Right.
So now I signed a different paperwork where I transfer the project to Moshe. So now Moshe has the Corsican brothers, and then one thing leads to another. It's a long story, but that was pretty much the genesis of Double Impact.
So basically, Firefight was responsible for the birth of Bloodsport, Lionheart, you directing, and of course now Double Impact, because like through all this aligning of the planets.
Right. One thing led to another, and like with Bloodsport, see, I was talking to Frank Dukes about the Kumite and all this stuff.
Right.
When he first told me, he said the word Bloodsport. So, it got very. The matches were full contact and so they got very bloody. So we had a nickname for them, and we called it Bloodsport. And I said, "Wow, that is a great title for a movie."
Awesome.
Right. So, anyways, we didn't write the script. We talked about sitting down writing the script, but we never did. And then while I'm doing the post-production on Firefight, this very low budget post-production house in Hollywood called Movie Tech. And in the room next to me, there's a guy named Ruben Mazzini, and he's cutting a porno movie. And so Ruben and we ended up talking a few times. He's right next door.
Right.
And I told him I'm a screenwriter. And right around that time, I'd first gotten hired to write Rambo 3.
Mm-hmm.
I told him this, and so he's thinking, "Wow, this guy must be this guy's got to be a real up and coming screenwriter." And he was impressed. Everybody was impressed when people who heard I've been hired to write Rambo 3 were pretty impressed by that, because the second Rambo was the biggest hit of the year, the previous year. It made more money than any other movie. Mm-hmm. So, anyways. He tells his producer, Mark DeSalle, that's the guy he was working for.
Right.
And Mark tells him, "Hey, I want to meet this guy and talk to him about writing a screenplay. So can you set up a lunch meeting?" So we have this lunch meeting, and Mark tells me, "I want you to write a project for me. It's going to be a martial arts project, because I've noticed that these different genres, different movie genres, they go in cycles. So there's war movies for a while, there's science fiction movies. Hasn't been any good martial arts movies for a while, and I think it's time to do a good kick-ass martial arts movie. So here's the idea I want to pitch to you. It's called Kickboxer." So he pitches Kickboxer to me. And his original concept for Kickboxer, and if you know Kickboxer, you'll know how the story, basically how the story is different from what I'm going to tell you what he pitched.
Okay.
Basically, Kurt has a fight in the U.S. with Tong Po, and he defeats Tong Po. So Tong Po feels very humiliated, and Kurt goes home, and that night he's in his house. He's in the kitchen with his mother, and Tong Po sneaks into the house, and Tong Po throws a kick at Kurt, and Kurt ducks. The kick misses Kurt, but it hits his mother in the face, and it kills his mother. Okay, Tong Po just killed his mother, and then Tong Po runs. Basically he flees. That was the Kickboxer story that Mark pitched to me. And I thought the whole mother thing sounded really hokey.
Right.
And I told him so. And I said, "Well, Mark, look, as long as you want to do a martial arts movie, I got one, which I think is better. It's called Bloodsport."
Yeah, it's Kumite.
Right, yeah. Well, he didn't know Kumite at the time. Nobody knew Kumite.
Right.
Nobody knew what Kumite was, but I said, Bloodsport. Wow, that's a great title for a martial arts movie. And I told him, "Look, it's based on this real guy, and I can show you They did a write-up on it in Black Belt magazine. And the real guy's name is Frank Dukes, and I know him personally, and I can introduce you to him if you want to meet him, if you're interested in this story. So that was the next step, is that we set up a meeting with Frank and Mark DeSalle, and Mark was liking this story more and more. And so he made a deal with Frank to tell his, quote, true life story, all right, and hired me, the guy who was writing Rambo 3, hired me to write the screenplay. So we had legal, we had documents drawn up and everything, and we both got paid very paltry sums of money. I think I got $1,500 to write the script. Seriously? Although there was more promise. If the movie went into production, then there was more promise. So I made a little more money than that. Okay. So that was the next step. Basically, I would talk to Frank about some of the details, and then I pretty much sat down and wrote the screenplay, turned it into Mark, and Mark liked the script, and he wanted to put it together and actually film this thing. So he had a friend, I'm trying to remember the guy's name, who was who did what was called gap financing. Basically, if you had a producer had a certain amount of money, but he needed more money to actually make the movie, that was the gap. So basically, it was gap financing. So he talked to his gap financing buddy, and that guy was going to put up the money to the money that Mark needed, the additional funds to make the movie. But he also, his name was Lou Horowitz. That was the guy's name. He had and basically that was his business. He would do gap financing, or he would also get projects set up with production companies. So he knew the guys at Canon, and he took the project to Canon Films, to Menachem and Yoram. And they were making lots of martial arts movies at the time. They were doing those ninja movies with Michael Dudikoff and Chuck Norris movies. So they really liked the idea of doing a martial arts movie. And next thing you know, we got a deal with Canon. So Mark basically transferred the rights to Canon Films. And the next step, we had no act in mind when we were writing the script. The next step was finding somebody to play Frank Dukes in this movie. And even before we had, this is before we had a director, they got Newt Arnold, but before Newt, they had the guy who directed Enter the Dragon was going to direct the film, and that somehow didn't work out. Then Canon was using Newt. Newt was basically a first assistant director who worked on a lot of big movies. And I think Newt helped them save a movie that was in trouble. And so Canon promised him, we're going to give you your own movie to direct. And that ended up being Bloodsport. We still didn't have a star. And what we needed was a Caucasian guy who knew martial arts, who could do martial arts, because he was going to have to do this stuff on camera, on screen. The guy had to be kind of young to work for the character. So he had to be in his 20s at least. Even 30s would have been too old, but a Caucasian guy in his 20s who could do the martial arts and make it look realistic. Okay. Now, Chuck Norris was mentioned just because, we're talking about the people who were doing Canon films at the time. So Chuck was mentioned. Well, Chuck's too old, really. Chuck was, I think he was like pushing 50 at the time. So he's too old to play this character. Well, then they suggested Michael Dudikoff. And Michael Dudikoff was starring in all these ninja movies for Canon. Right. Thing is, Michael Dudikoff was not a real martial artist. Michael was playing a So basically, he had the ninja garb on. You couldn't see his face when he was doing the fight scenes. And they had Shokasugi and Steve Lambert in the ninja outfit doing the actual fighting. So you couldn't actually put Michael Dudikoff on screen, on camera, and have him doing all these fancy martial arts movies. And it was a lot of them. Basically, it was a fight movie. It was fight, fight, fight.
Right.
So Michael wasn't going to work. So then there were some other names bandied about. And then, again, it's serendipity. You know, the stars were aligned. Jean-Claude had met Menachem at the Cannes Film Festival. And nothing ever came of that. But then he and Michelle Kesey are in Los Angeles. They're driving down La Cienega Boulevard, and they see Menachem Golan coming out of a restaurant. And so Jean-Claude tells Michelle, he turned the car around. There's this Menachem Golan. He goes up to Menachem and he says, hey, Menachem, you remember me? Jean-Claude Van Damme. Yeah. And he throws a kick at Menachem's face.
Right.
Misses him by 2 inches. He used to do this to everybody. He did it to me, that was his calling card, okay? Like, hey, Van Damme, boom, throws a kick at your face.
Right.
And when Menachem saw this, he had his assistant Karen with him and said, Karen, get him Bloodsport. And he tells Jean-Claude, come to my office tomorrow, we'll have a meeting. I have a project for you. And basically that's how it came together. Menachem was impressed with Jean-Claude, and Jean-Claude ended up being the perfect guy. And again, another piece of serendipity. No Retreat, No Surrender was playing on theater screens in LA right around this time. So we could actually go to a theater and see Jean-Claude playing the villain in a martial arts movie. Okay, No Retreat, No Surrender. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if you've ever seen the movie, but Jean-Claude's martial, you seen it?
Yes.
Yeah, Jean-Claude's pretty damn spectacular in it.
Right.
Yeah, so enough said. You know, so Mark calls me and Frank Dukes and says, hey guys, I think we got somebody who's a potential star for the movie.
Right.
His name he's Jean-Claude Van Damme. He's in this movie. Yeah, Mark was from New York and had, you know, he had a hard time pronouncing foreign names. Jean-Claude Van Damme. And he tells me and Frank, hey, go see this movie, No Retreat, No Surrender, and see what you think.
Right. And
we were blown away. We thought this guy Jean-Claude was just spectacular. So we were enthusiastic about it. And the next thing you know, it's all coming together. Now they've got the director, they've got the star, and then they found Canon had found an opportunity to film in Hong Kong. They're always looking for places where they could film, where they could save money. Mm-hmm. So there was a guy named Charlie Wang who had a production services company in Hong Kong. Mm-hmm. We ended up using Charlie on Double Impact also. So Charlie basically gave them a really good deal if they could shoot the movie in Hong Kong. So basically the script was reworked, and so now it's taking place in Hong Kong. And then everybody's off to Hong Kong.